So everybody, this is Karl, and that was Karl's dog, who I'm hoping you'll hear more from later on, although all the content will come from Karl, not his dog. All right, so welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we'll be looking at engineering employer branding and how to be a talent magnet. So today we're going to discuss how to identify why employees join your company, how to use writing to build your brand and share it with the community. Then finally, learning how to engage your engineers to spread the word about it within the community. But first, some quick housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and please do feel free to add any questions at any time in the Ask a Question link below the video. But there will be a Q&A section at the end where you can ask your questions directly to Karl. So, emceeing today's Byte session is myself, Ezechi Britton. I'm a founding member, principal and CTO in residence at ImpactX Capital, and also the co-founder of Code Untapped, the digital skills accelerator. We identify, upskill, and place underrepresented diverse technologists. So it's with great pleasure for me to introduce you all to Karl Hughes, founder at Draft.dev. Karl, how about you give us a quick introduction, talk a little bit about yourself, your journey, and why this is so important to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ezechi, and thanks everybody for joining today. This is probably a little bit of a different topic than I'm guessing CTO Craft gets into, but that's good. So yeah, I have spent the last 8 years in Chicago as a sort of engineering manager and then head of engineering and CTO at a couple of small startups, and went through a lot of the early hands-on days of those startups, as well as the kind of slightly later getting into growth and hiring and just the like constant need for more engineering bodies and hands to do good work. And one of the things that stood out to me as I was in my latest role last year was that as a small company, you are competing with the same talent as the huge players, the Googles, the Facebooks, the big name brands that everybody, wants to work at, but you don't have that same luxury of name recognition. And in a place like Chicago, where there's hundreds or thousands of startups that get funded every year, it's really, really hard to stand out as a unique, have a unique perspective and a unique reason that people want to seek you out as an employer, rather than you having to go out and actively recruit and kind of get the second tier people, the people who couldn't get hired at Google. And so one of the things that stood out to me was that a lot of small companies and even a lot of medium companies don't do a great job of branding themselves as an employer. And when you think about it, yeah, the marketing team is out there branding the company, but people don't necessarily work for the marketing team, especially your engineers. They're not thinking about what marketing is doing on a day-to-day basis. What they think about is, what is my boss like? And what is the culture of this organization actually like? And do people get to have fun on the weekends, or do they work 24/7? They want to know those kinds of things. And it seems so simple, but so few organizations actually broadcast their like kind of work-life balance or their sort of take on being an engineering organization and what the priorities are, that it was a really good way for us to stand out. So what I did as kind of our core recruiting, instead of thinking of recruiting as the thing we do when we have an open job rec, it was, I'm always recruiting. It's just a question of when we're actually going to accept an applicant. And so I was always out at meetups, conferences, just kind of putting our brand out there, and not just our brand as a company, because that's we weren't selling to engineers, so it wasn't helpful to put that out there. What was helpful was to put us out there as an organization, engineering organization, what we were building, the kinds of problems we were solving, the sort of the mission that we had as a group, and then how we got along together and things like that. Those are the things that your employees want to know, or your prospective employees want to know. And so by going out there and proactively speaking at events, running meetups, writing blog posts, which we'll talk about a lot more today, it was really, I don't want to say it's ever easy to hire, but it was not like we had to go try to like clamor for the people who just happened to be looking at jobs. When I was ready to hire, what I did was I had basically a Rolodex, a big spreadsheet of engineers I'd talked to over the last couple of years, or who had written me about blog posts I'd written, and just said, hey, any of y'all looking for something, or just kind of thinking about a change? We've got an opening. And it's just like a night and day difference in recruiting. Instead of recruiting, this kind of desperation, like cold email, talk to your recruiter is going to charge you 25% of their first year salary and all that. Like I was just opening up a sheet of people who liked me and saying, hey, do you want to work with me? And it was a totally different worlds from my last few hires at the Great Network. And so I've been, when I started Draft.dev, what we do is we create technical content for engineering blogs. And generally what we do is work with marketing departments that don't, that want to like sell to a technical team or technical audience. But I have a couple clients that are on the software engineering team. And what they need is just help building up a content plan and editing content and things like that. So I end up working with some of those other organizations to do this kind of stuff. And so that's kind of why I got here and got pulled into this conversation, which I'm really excited about.
Fantastic. I mean, it's such a difficult thing as a hiring manager or as the CEO of a startup, trying to work out how do I find the great people that I need to. And one of the questions I often get asked about, and I think it's important given it's Black History Month, is how do I attract more diverse individuals into my organizations? And I know this is something that Andy Skipper and CTO Craft, CTO Craft Bytes takes really, really seriously. And one of the places where people start often is the job spec, right? And it's interesting what you just talked about regarding, as opposed to how do we reach out, but how do we get them to reach us, right? And so I think that's really fascinating insight. So let's touch in on some of this, right? As part of that, surely one of the key things you need to be able to do is really to identify why an engineer joins your company. You talked a little bit about work-life balance, for example, but how do you go about finding that information out, and why is it so important to you?
Yeah, there's two ways that I think about this. Side one is, why did your current team of engineers join? Now, the reality is, we come into an organization and there was probably some history before we started there. It's not like we rarely come in and start the whole thing from scratch. So chances are there's a bunch of people on the team that you don't know why they joined, or you don't know them that well, or you haven't you don't have that same connection as the people you brought in and onboarded, So the first thing is talk to people. And I know that always sounds so obvious to say, but I'll just reiterate it, because sometimes as CTOs, we get a little bit in our tech and leadership world, and we forget that the people all quote unquote below us are super core to why what we're doing works. And so talk to them in whatever that means for you, if it's in their regular reviews or quarterly reviews or whatever you do, just asking what drove you to join in the first place. Mm-hmm. And when you can find out from that, were they leaving a bad job and it was more about just any opportunity to get me out, or were they really excited about this opportunity? And if they were excited about this opportunity, was it because of the product they were going to work on, or was it because of the team they were joining? Maybe they knew the boss they hired into. And learning those things is really helpful, because the reason that people joined you in the past is probably the biggest reason you're going to get new people in the future, unless you change something significant. And that's always hard to do with any size organization. Change is hard. So anyway, that's side one. The other side is talking to people who are applying for jobs and asking them this question. And if you've got a recruiter who's your first line of interviewing, then you just put this on their sheet of questions to ask. If you want to do this later, that's fine too. But you ask how did you hear about this listing, or us as a company? Did you know about us as a company before this listing? If, on the other hand, you're doing most of the outreach yourself, say you're searching for somebody in a really specific role, and it requires not just, opening up a job rec and saying, I hope I get some applicants. It's one of those ones where you're going to go out and email people that you specifically know might be good contacts. You can kind of keep track. What I do I have a kind of a whole system for personal networking, where I keep a big spreadsheet of people that I want to keep in touch with, and I kind of have a route of how I met them originally, as well as
I try to do this, absolutely fail at it. I have endless spreadsheets where I've tried to keep things updated, LinkedIn, mobile phone contact lists. I'm just terrible at it.
Yeah, it's hard, and I don't know that this works for everybody. I always say that any advice I give is it's what's worked for me. It's not universally applicable. So big asterisks on everything, but just one thing, whatever it is for you, whatever that system is, think about how you can track back to what's actually working, because in the long term, you want to keep doing more of what's working and do a little less of what isn't working as well. So for example, Well, blogging is a tough one because it's probably going to take 6 months to a year before you're going to see results from something like blogging. And even probably speaking at conferences is going to be similar. It's just none of these things turn around really quickly. And that's why a lot of organizations resist doing them, because they, someone up the chain says, well, we didn't see an ROI from that. We spent $5,000 or 10,000 man hours on this. Like, they want to see ROI quickly. And whereas, it's interesting, like as much as recruiters are expensive, at the same time, they kind of show you, like, you spent 25K, you got 100K employee or whatever that number is for you, that it's very, it's numerical in a way that is predictable. Whereas blogging, you might invest 25K and not see anything for years. And that's really hard for a lot of organizations to swallow. But there are other advantages and other reasons to do this besides just recruiting people. So kind of save that for later. But yeah, so identifying people, it's about, side one is looking at your current workforce of engineers and talking to them about how they found you. Step two, looking at new applicants and saying, how did you find out about us? How did you hear about us? Have you heard of our blog or our conferences, or did you know someone personally? All that. And then step three is thinking about how you want people to find you in the future. And this is the hard one, so I save it for last, because the truth is, like, to shift your culture in a way that's significant enough to change how people like perceive you and why they go to your company, it's going to take time. It's going to take a big effort, even if you're a small organization, because there's so much you're going to have to fight history. For example, if you've had a lot of bad reviews on Glassdoor, like if you're going to go to like fight that, I mean, it can happen, but it's going to take, you're digging for the long haul here. You're not going to do it overnight. And people are checking those sorts of things now, as well as calling your past employees. So if you've got a bunch of disgruntled past employees, like, you might want to think about, like, there's probably no way to reach out and like make them happier, but just like know that they exist in the world, and they're, if someone asks them, they might say negative things about you. The world that we live,
even more important though, right? To understand, it's not just about why people want to work for you or chose to work for you, but also why they chose not to.
That's a good point. And like why they leave. And so if you're not doing exit interviews where you ask people, what are you moving into? And sometimes it's obvious, and like we have to be accepting of it, right? Like it's totally fine if someone leaves your organization to take a much bigger role that you just don't have room for, and that's like life. So we just stay in touch, leave on a happy note. And it's like, well, we didn't have a big enough opportunity for that person. That just means we need to grow faster. We need to be, we need to be bigger if we want to keep good people. But when people leave that are good people and they're just leaving for a lateral move, that's when you really have to ask yourself, like, what are we doing wrong here that people are moving on from the company for?
So when we look at this, could you give some examples of great companies that have done this? Well, actually, let's start with please don't name any, right? I don't want to get sued. Called up, I'm sure Andy doesn't either. But can you give us some examples where maybe you've seen companies doing this really badly, right? And we'll come on to examples for the various other aspects that we focus on, but particularly when it comes to identifying why people work for them. So I think we make a lot of assumptions around why people work for us. And again, going back to the job spec and the role profile, that tends to be where most companies engage with external staff, right? Or potential staff, right? So in your experience, where have you seen companies really get this wrong? And what's been the core reason for that?
So what goes wrong here are, I think the two biggest things I see are assuming that everyone that joined because of salary, and just assuming it's always money or benefits. And certainly, like, we all want to make a certain baseline of money and benefits. But at a point, like, software engineers, like most people, are not just motivated by incremental improvements in their salary. I mean, once they've made some cap where they can provide for their family and they have a good life, they have enough time off, they have benefits that, like health insurance or whatever you need, depending on where you're at. What do you do when you add 5% to their salary every year? It's not, that's probably not going to keep great people. What does keep great people is interesting things to work on, or the people that they work with and the respect they have for those people. So the other thing that I think a lot of employers do poorly is portraying roles as being very interesting, and then reality of the role is not very interesting. So you see this in a lot of job recs that talk about the really cool projects that you're going to work on as this engineer. And then when you get in there, I mean, I feel like every engineer has a story of this, where like, I joined because I was going to work on GraphQL and these cool new technologies that I've never done before. You get in there and it's like, no, the whole thing is a 40-year-old Postgres database or 30-year-old Postgres database that no one knows how to touch without breaking some stored procedures. It's like, so like we can't do anything here. But that's like, it's like that difference in reality versus what you advertise in a job is a huge problem. Now it's like, there are interesting technical challenges in old software. And I think a lot of companies just think that like, people only want the latest and greatest. And so if we're not rebuilding our front end every 2 years, we're going to lose employees. It's like, I don't know. I think
it's not the best plans, right, to do that anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we're also, I think anybody who's a little bit of experience in technology realizes how you have to look for the long game here. Software sticks around a lot longer than we think it will. But anyway, so back to the question of doing this poorly. I think the biggest things I see with organizations doing it poorly are they're just putting expectations in the wrong places, or assuming that people joined purely because of salary. And when you assume that people join purely because of salary and benefits, you think the way to keep them is continue improving salary and benefits. But if you have a rotten culture, you have bad managers, you aren't promoting good people, or you have just really mismanaged projects for people to work on, you're going to lose people regardless of how much you pay them. And you're going to lose really good people, and you're going to keep people who are just kind of like doing the bare minimum. And so some of this too is maybe looking at your organization as a whole and thinking about like, are people here just for the stable job and like get the paycheck and go home? They all do their hours per week and that's it. Or do people come here because they really enjoy it, and do they enjoy the team they're with? There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong in either of those two approaches to building a team and a company. I mean, I think you can have a perfectly functional team that just comes in, clocks their hours and leaves and doesn't do anything on the side and doesn't, they don't hang out after work. I think that's perfectly fine. But know that that's your culture. Don't go recruit people telling them, oh, we all hang out, we're all best friends, we work, 20-hour days because we love it. Like, don't lie about it. Set the expectation to be what it is.
And not everybody wants that, right? Not everyone wants to go to work and spend time with their colleagues afterwards and
exactly
play foosball or ping pong or whatever it is. A lot of people just want to get in, do their job, make a difference, go home, right? Yes. So with that, can you give me an example where you've seen this done really well? Right? I know we're going to get into how you built that brand in a moment, but just that identifying, what was at the core of their business, of why people join them.
Yeah. I think the companies that get out there and either build things in public to show how what they do is like show what they do and the quality of software that they build and the kind of projects they manage. So for example, there's a couple big open source companies that do a really good job of involving the community in their GitHub repositories and their public projects. So if you could do that, you're showing engineers who might want to work for you someday exactly what it's like to work here in a way that is super hard for your competitors, your competing hirers to reproduce. And so something I've always done is when I coming into a new engineering organization, we start a small open source project that we can maintain and build and show people just as a way to it's small. They're small projects. They're just like 2 or 3 page apps that just kind of show people, this is the style of architecture we build. This is the test coverage we expect. This is the kind of projects we do. And then we actually use those for a lot of our job interviews. We'll have open issues in GitHub for people to work on with us. So it's a great way to show them this is what it's actually like working with us, rather than the abstract idea of working with a team. So that's something I think you can do to really stand out. And I think that, blogging goes into this whole same idea. It's like, instead of just telling people in the job description and during the interview process, this is what we do and this is how great our culture is, you can show them every month with a new blog post, and they can cover things that people would ask you in job interviews, which is great because you're heading off these questions and giving them resources that show that you've thought about this rather than just being reactive all the time.
And so, because a lot of people like to use blogs more as a marketing tool, and it's a pure marketing tool, right? But here, what you're actually saying, from my understanding, is use it as a way to educate people about what your business is, what it does, set their expectations early on before they even walk through the door, right? That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So
And even, well, go ahead. Yeah.
no,
Because I
no,
think we'll
no,
talk about
no,
that
no,
more.
no, please, everyone's here to hear you. Go, go, go.
No, I was going to say, like, even thinking of the blog, not just as an active, like a recruiting tool, but as a like answer common questions tool, because where else do you put things like, what do we do when there's a conflict in the organization, right? You probably have an internal wiki, but like, why not make that public? What are you hiding by putting it internal? Like there's a lot of things out there that are really beneficial to be shown publicly. And I think the other thing too is that, that I may be in a transition generation where there's people who are, have more experience than me or older than me that would be like, well, that kind of stuff doesn't need to be public. And then there's people younger than me that want everything to be public to an extent that I think is weird. So think about the fact that you're going to be hiring younger and younger people in the future. This is the way the world works. So this next generation might be even more into transparency. They may not just want blog posts. They may want videos and podcasts of you talking about your engineering organization. And that may become, I don't want to say it's going to be the norm, but it could be something they look for actively rather than just a nice, icing on the cake kind of feature.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see the first startup that actually live streams their entire business. Literally day in, day out, consensus meetings, everything. I guarantee you it will happen. Okay, so
I'm making a note of that. I'm going to check back.
It's going to happen, and that's going to be a great one for you to write about, I promise you. So look, we've talked a lot there about how to identify why employees join your company and why this is important. But let's get to the meat of it today now, right? I mean, the next big thing you're here to talk about really is, well, once you understand this, how do you use that, right? How do you use writing to build your brand and then share it with the community? So let's talk a bit about this whole process of writing blogs, utilizing that, growing that brand, getting that message out there.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with the caveat that blogging is not like, it does not equal branding. It is not the only, it's like a small piece of what could be considered like a total branding package, and I'm kind of getting into marketing speak here, but that branding is a very marketing word. And so I'll just, don't worry about the word branding and marketing as a whole. The point of it is like, how can we show people what it's like to be here so that we attract the right kind of talent in the future, or that we keep the right talent, both. So anyway, blogging is just one piece. There's a lot of things you can do. And if your team is not strong in writing, or you personally are just not like interested in writing, there's certainly other ways to do this, whether it's meetups you go to and sponsor or speak at, with conferences you sponsor or speak at, whether it is one-on-one networking, just going out and meeting people in the community that are doing interesting things. Open source projects, again, are great. Videos are getting more popular. Going on podcasts as either a guest or hosting your own are both great strategies to get your brand out there. So I'm saying all that to say that let's not, get like too focused on writing before you've thought about what else your team might have as a strength. But because we're talking about writing, and I do mostly writing, I'll get into that and answer your questions.
We'll allow it for this one.
Right. I like to put it out there because I think I don't want to, again, like my way of doing things is not the only way, and it's not the only way that works either. And so I want you as whoever you are, leader, whatever your role is, like to think about like, what do I do, or my team, what strengths do they have that we could do to just convey this whole idea of let's show who we are. So anyway, with writing, the way I approach it is this. First, I decide what's actually important for the organization. And that goes back to our first question of like, how do we decide how people came to us in the first place and why they're coming to us and continue coming to us? So it's, looking at what's recruited people well in the past, what traits they're looking for in a job that we meet or seem to meet, and then why people stick around. Like, what are they excited about working on? What are they excited about when it comes to a day-to-day job? Do they just like their boss? Like, if we want to show we have the best managers in the world, that's a perfectly fine thing to try to convey through writing and through your blog. It doesn't have to be just like, this is the projects we work on. There's no one formula for this. You want to decide what's important for your organization. And then the other thing to think about with like the priorities and kind of getting things in your head first is like thinking about the organization's vision or purpose or mission or whatever. Now, like there's kind of the overarching company mission, but then I like to think of engineering as having its own little mission. In a lot of times, like it is to enable the company's mission, yes, but like a lot of times engineering, and it depends how your company is structured. Maybe product is part of engineering, or maybe they're like, different organizations. Maybe there's some kind of weird hybrid thing. So it can get pretty messy. But like thinking about like whatever organization it is you want to brand, thinking about like how do we want to contribute to the company's overall mission? So is it just by building products, or is it by like leading as technologists, or is it by solving problems and just like being a resource for them to come to? Like just thinking a little holistically. And if you haven't gone through that kind of exercise, there's some good books. I'll have to go look up like about how you can kind of do that sort of mission and vision statement for an engineering org specifically. Okay, so you decide what's important. You decide what your mission and vision are going to be for the organization. And from that should flow your sort of content plan, which is really just a showcase of how you are actually doing those things that you say you want to do. In other words, like it's kind of the same way how when a job candidate comes to you and on their resume, it says they've worked in Python for 10 years. That's great, but like, show me, prove it to me, right? Like I can't just take that for face value anymore. That's too easy to lie. And so what we all do is we have either some level of programming test that we give people, or we ask them for, submit a project at work. We look at their open source contributions, or we go talk to their former bosses, whatever. All we're doing there is we're vetting that they actually do what they say they do. So think about your blog the same way, or whatever your branding efforts are is the same way. It's not just telling people what you want to be, it's showing them how you actually have done it in the past and continue to do it. So to give a really concrete example, we are the last company I worked with, we were an education technology company. So we sold to schools, and we sold a tool that helped students become better writers. So when we are thinking about like, how do we want to brand our engineering organization? Like, to be honest, I wanted to brand us as a company of an engineering organization that cared about writing and cared about students learning to write better, because that's what the company wants. And I wanted to hire engineers who were in line with that same mission. Now this is kind of unique to small startups. I know a lot of like bigger companies. I worked at GE in the past. When I worked at GE Appliances, it's not like we hired people based on them loving appliances, right? Like, there's not quite that same like level of excitement around appliances, but there were other things that we cared about. The commitment to quality that GE has is like a really good one. So we only would hire engineers that really showed that they like cared about the finer details and the quality level that, GE is big in Six Sigma and all that kind of thing. So anyway, whatever it is for your organization, try to like be honest with it in your content, like the kind of content you want to produce. Now, what I do with clients I work with is we sit down and talk about this stuff, and then we generate what's called a content plan. It's basically like 6 to 12 briefs, which are like a prompt for the article. Like it's kind of like a quick, here's what the article is going to say and how it's going to work and what questions should be answered. It's a little bit about the audience that it's supposed to reach. And then it's kind of a bullet point outline of 10 to 12 things that we really want to cover and what rough order they need to be in. And a lot of times what we'll do is we'll add in resources or examples, and then we'll kind of distribute each of these briefs to the specific engineers or writers that we want to work on them. And so in doing that, we're basically laying out and this is, I'm saying this like it's top down. To be honest, you should be like talking to your team as well about like, what do you want to write about? How do you want to showcase our brand? But like a lot of these things are going to become pretty obvious. So for example, if you have a team member who's worked on a really interesting technical problem that you want to showcase because it shows like some of the interesting stuff that your engineers solve, then you just get with them to talk about like, how would we outline this thing? What would the brief look like? The reason we start with these briefs is that writing is about at least half of the work of writing is deciding what you're going to write about and how you're going to approach and solve that problem. And we're going to talk about structure a little bit later, because this is one of the biggest hurdles that new writers have to writing. It's just like
I know that's definitely one of my issues as well.
Exactly.
I'm glad you're picking up on that one.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's like, where do I start? And so creating that content plan helps with like just knowing like this is where you start. And if nothing else, you at least have a pitch that kind of gives you like some direction. At best, you have an outline as well. And then you start writing. And that's just like the grind. To be honest, like all this fun high level stuff that we get to do is like 1/50th of the work. The rest is just the grind of writing, researching, editing, and it's like it needs to happen. And this is where people get like, I think they lose steam in this section, because it's like, well, we got all these great ideas, but now we got to go write them, and we have to make space for the engineers to write them, and they're all busy and they have things to do. Like, how do we do that kind of thing? It's really hard. And it just goes on, and it's kind of you have to keep plodding through for months, and you then like maybe see it work, once in a year. And again, that's why this is so hard, and that's why a lot of orgs don't do it, is just because there's not a guaranteed payoff, and it's not a short path to branding yourself, or just to like attracting the best employees, which is the end goal. But you got to do it if you're going to go this path. So you start writing, you edit, you get stuff published. There's a lot of tactical things that we could dive into. I'm not necessarily going to right now, but like the things like, where do I publish this stuff? Should it be on Medium? Should I have my own website? Should it be in GitHub pages? Like, there's no right answer to that, but there's lots of opinions and pros and cons. And then do we write in Markdown? Do we write in Google Docs? Do we, does the editor just ask the writer to do everything, or does the editor actually go in and fix everything for them and does it all need to have the same kind of style and voice? Or are we okay with every writer being slightly different? Do we want every engineer to write, or just 3 or 4 of them that are maybe the most committed? No right answer to all these questions, but like this is the kind of things you should think about as you get into the nuts and bolts. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention on like how you actually do this is you have to share what you're writing about. And about half of my clients, even though I tell them this, they still miss this part, because it feels hard to do when you've spent all this time writing, and then you realize, well, I'm only halfway up the hill. I've still got to push this out to people in some way. And so I send my clients like a checklist of things they can do to promote each blog post. That helps take some of the mental energy out of it. It's kind of like all the places you can publish a technical blog post that are good, receptive audiences. And I can give you a link to that so we can share that around.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic if you can drop that.
Oh yeah. But besides that, you also just want to think about like what your company has internally, because your employees themselves are probably your greatest asset as far as sharing stuff. So dropping it in the engineering Slack channel and being like, hey, could you all share this around to people? So-and-so just wrote it, really cool to see it. You got to promote, like, we just want to get this out in front of people, have them all post it to LinkedIn or Twitter if they're involved there or whatever. You don't want to come off as spammy and overly self-promotional. You want to maybe treat it as, let's highlight the cool things our engineers do. Let's highlight our team. Let's highlight the accomplishments we've made, and just be genuine about this stuff. Being, in the goal and aim of being kind of transparent, more transparent than most orgs are. There's a bunch of stuff in there, and we can dig into whatever you want as, but
absolutely. And if no one asks any questions at the end, I've got a bunch of questions I want to go into around some of those things. But let's roll on to the next piece, and then we can come back to some of that. So look, we've talked about identifying why engineers want to work for your organizations or don't want to work for your organization, right? We've talked about how you go about then actually structuring a blog and getting it out there to a degree, and why that's so important. But you touched on a really interesting piece there, which was getting your engineers involved in this process. So, as we both know, engineers, super busy, not always the most outwardly creative people, although I feel technology is a highly creative activity, right? Coding, you're literally taking an idea and turning it into something and then distributing that. But I don't often feel that writing is an important part of their job. And in fact, most programmers got into programming because they didn't want to have to write English essays, right? So
exactly.
How do you get your team involved in this way?
Yeah. There's a sad bit there about like the state of education. I remember when I went to engineering school, like I remember it being one of the perks of going to engineering school was that you didn't have to do a writing intensive class, or if you did, it was like you're kind of like, give me like engineering reports class, which was BS. But I think it's too bad, because the further up the engineering leadership chain you get, the more writing you end up doing. And it's sad that we don't prepare our baseline engineers to be ready for this, being a leader who not only has to communicate the needs of their own personal needs, they have to communicate the needs of their whole team in concise ways to really busy people. Communication is really hard. And now that we're all working remotely, it's like writing is even more of a huge thing, and it should be something we we really think about. Anyway, I won't get on that soapbox for any longer. I'll stay focused, I promise. So the engaging engineers with writing, or getting engineers to write. The first thing is having a good plan up front that they're bought into. So that content planning part where you're not only just telling them like, this is the high level, what we want to convey. Maybe you're getting ideas from them. You're soliciting your team like, hey, do you have any ideas that would relate to this overall mission? It's a lot easier to get people to write about things that they're kind of excited about than something that they have like been forced to write. So to be honest, like having them involved and at least interested, or maybe being able to pick their topics that they write about based on giving them 5 or 6 topics and saying, which one of these would you like or be most interested in? And if, it's like, if you come up with 10 topics and only 8 of them get picked, leave the last 2, don't worry about them, right? Like this isn't an exact science where it's like, we have to hit these 10 things or else the blog's not going to work. It's a lot more subjective than that. So let them have some autonomy in picking what they want to write about. Right. Let them suggest ideas. Let them get invested in it. And, you're going to have to kind of sell them on writing and get them excited about it, especially if you have an existing organization of people who are not bought into the idea of writing. Now, the plus side is once you start doing it, and you start blogging, you start showing how several engineers are contributing. What's going to happen is you're going to attract other engineers that might be interested in that kind of like doing that as well, because they see that, oh, well, the engineers at this company, they get to write stuff about what they're working on. That's kind of cool. I'd like to try that. And so you're now going to automatically start to favor people who are in this, like who have that same mentality or might be interested in that. And again, you don't have to have everybody contribute. It can certainly be an opt-in thing where people are basically saying like, yes, I want to do it this month or next month, but after that, I'm going to take a break, or maybe they do it and they get into a role and they really like it. You never know. So anyway, you got to find a way to like sort of pick the people who are ready for it. The next thing you have to do as a manager and leader is create the space and time for it. And this is the part that I think where a lot of engineering managers and CTOs get like stonewalled here, because we have these like productivity goals that we are shooting for as an organization, and often it's it's like some kind of points on the agile sprint board or whatever. And if somebody slips on that, you're like, well, what were you doing? But to be honest, writing is a time intensive task. It's going to take somebody, especially a new writer who doesn't write often, it might take them 8 hours to write a blog post. But that's a full unblocked day of work, which nobody's getting 8-hour blocks of work anyway. So that ends up being 2 or 3 days probably of their free time. So you have to think to yourself, are we as an organization ready to lose a certain amount of productivity in the name of the long-term goal of making it easier to recruit people in the future? And that's, again, this is the kind of hard trade-offs that we have to make as leaders, is like deciding, is immediate productivity like so much more important than long-term recruiting that we're willing to, sacrifice one for the other. But that's just something to think about. And maybe that time is maybe in order to mitigate that, you just do one blog post a month, which, honestly, one blog post a month, you do it for 4 years, you have a lot of content. I mean, close to 50 pieces there. And that's a ton more than most engineering organizations ever do. So it's not a bad thing to just go slow and let this happen, a little bit at a time. And then the next thing, once you've created some way to have space and time for everybody, so you've got a like expectation that people can sign up for this, they get 2 days off of, their regular work or their regular sprint on the week that they're going to write a blog post or whatever you want to do there. You've got to celebrate it when it happens. And that partly like promoting it is part of that, but also just like internally, like saying good job to the people. I know it sounds so simple, but like when an engineer who has never written a blog post before finally finishes their first blog post, it probably feels like a big deal to them. And if you don't acknowledge it, what's the chance they're going to come back and do that again? Like that was that was a huge mental hurdle for them. And so not giving that recognition, the like good job, the praise there is a surefire way to make this whole thing just kind of, flatline really quickly and nobody wants to get involved. You can also do it yourself. And I think this is something leaders should have at least some voice on the blog, whether it's through, and there's a couple ways to do this. So kind of like as an aside here, there's a couple hacks, like as a C-level executive or VP of engineering or what have you, you're busy. And so you can decide, do I actually want to write this stuff myself? Do I want to write vision of the engineering organization type articles that maybe you do have a really good sense of, they're easy for you to write? Or do you want to hire like a ghostwriter who will do that kind of thing for you, and you can just meet with them a couple hours and then they write it and you kind of sign off on it, do the final like cleanup to make sure it sounds like you? That's another way. Or you can dictate things and have a writer then go through and clean it up and make it a more coherent article. So you can, if it's easier for you to say while you're on your morning walk, just dictate an article, then maybe you can have someone write that up and clean it up for you. Those are certainly those services you can buy. I don't do any of that myself personally, but like you search for like technology ghostwriters, you're going to find a lot of people that do that. And I know a couple too, if you want an introduction, if anybody's out there interested in that kind of thing. So that's another thing. And then the last thing that I'll mention is if you're going to ask your engineers to do this task that is hard, and you're going to show that, yes, I'll do it as well, but you've got to also like help them out. Like that might mean giving them access to somebody to ask questions about, like maybe somebody on your marketing team who's good at writing can like help, guide them through some of the finer points of writing, or do some of the editing with them. Maybe it is, if they're a more junior engineer, maybe you can pair them up with a more senior engineer to make sure that they didn't miss anything technically if they're writing a more technical article. If it is just a whole, like, I don't even know where to get started thing, maybe you want to, get them a course on basic writing. Like this stuff sounds, it just depends where your team is at. And so there's not a simple formula for this either, but definitely something you want to do is show that support. So not only a celebration of doing it, but show that you are going to help them through it.
So what I'm hearing there is that there needs to be a real commitment from the technology leadership and potentially the company leadership as well, that this is something that we're going to do, right? It's lead by example. It's support your developers in actually doing this work. Maybe give them a little bit of coaching and mentoring around that, but then celebrate it when they do actually get this content out there, right? So again, just wrapping up a little bit on this, have you seen any fantastic examples of this that you can point to?
Yeah, I really like, there's a few companies that are in the tech space that I pay attention to their engineering blogs because I think they do a good job of this. There's Buffer, buffer.com, and they have, since their beginning, they've always run a company blog that was like, at first it was written by the founders, and then they as they hired people on, they've sort of slowly added them to the blog. They basically had all employees contribute to the company blog, and then they eventually broke that company blog up into like 4 or 5 distinct blogs, and one of them is now their Buffer Overflow, which is their engineering blog. So they've branded each of these blogs, and they make them, it's super interesting because they actually make them part of the company marketing as well as engineering marketing. And I think it's really a hard line to toe, but if you search for like Buffer engineering blog, you can see how they're doing it. Medium's engineering blog is also really good. They go into a lot of specifics about how they, especially with management, which I think is really helpful, has been helpful for me as a engineering manager. It's just like learning about how these larger, more established organizations with a lot of smart people in them are doing management, and just pulling those tricks from them. It's been really great. And it gives me a more favorable view of Medium as a company, even though I don't really know what it's like to work there. So it makes me feel like I kind of know these people, even though I don't. And then the last one is Slack. Also does a really good job of their engineering blog. So again, search Slack engineering blog. The big 4 things that I kind of think point to them being really strong in the space of engineering, branding, and blogging is they talk about interesting problems they've solved. So they're going into real technical depth. They're not just, saying it's like clearly not written by a marketer. These are clearly things written by people who know really interesting things that I, as an engineer, am curious to know about. So unlocking my curiosity, like I know engineers, like you said, they're not creative, but like they're creative in a different way, right? Like it's not like they're
exactly.
Yeah.
And I didn't say they're not creative. I think they don't see themselves as creative.
Right. That's a good point. It's like their internal monologue is, I'm not creative, I'm an engineer. But the reality is they're creative and they're curious, and they want to learn things. And so showing them that you do interesting things at the company, if you really do. And again, like this goes to the whole, like, don't lie about it, but like do show when you have interesting problems. That's one part. The next one is that they're technical, as in like they're clearly written by engineers, but they're not super jargony so that only people inside the company can understand them. Because you have to think, like, yes, maybe the hardest thing to recruit for is senior engineers. So you only want to talk at senior engineers level. But like the honest truth is junior engineers become senior engineers at some point in their career. And you might, bring them into your blog as junior engineers and they follow along for years until they're actually like, I don't know, hireable for you, whatever that means. But anyway, just the point is like, make it approachable. Don't make it super full of jargon. Don't assume that people just, have to know a ton just to get in. Make it a pretty, try to make it technical, but also approachable. And then consistency is huge. I mean, again, you don't have to do it. You don't have to post every week, but if you do it at least every couple of months, I think it's a lot better cadence than doing it once a year or once and then never again. So just some level of consistency is important. And then finally, having more than one participant in the blog is really good. So the small companies, I mean, you may only have one or two people who are willing to do it, but all the blogs I mentioned, Buffer and Medium and Stack Overflow, they have a wide range of voices, and they actually, with theirs, they don't worry about them being different or inconsistent. Sometimes, like, it's authentic, and they sort of realize that these are people, not just, they're engineers, they're not professional writers, so it's not going to always be perfect, but it's like getting your company out there in a way that is just unique and different. It makes you stand out from the millions of other places with open job listings at this moment.
I think that's a really good piece of advice. If I think back on my engineering days, any blog posts I read were typically about solving a problem, right? It was a particular piece, there's a particular challenge I was struggling with and I was looking for a solution. And maybe someone had come across that exact same problem and tried to solve it in a way. And one of the things I've always thought to myself is, when I've solved a problem that I couldn't find an answer to, why not write about it, right? And just, even at the beginning stage, just talk about what I did. And if you think about it, often you have to present that back to your own teammates anyway, but then it doesn't go anywhere. It just sits on your laptop somewhere, right? Yep. So it's all about trying to self-promote a little bit. So, everyone, we're now officially at the end of the main section. We're into Q&A. We haven't got any questions yet asked by the audience, which is fine. Sometimes, it can be quite nerve-wracking asking a question in front of all your peers. So I've got tons of questions. So if no one's going to ask,
you kick us off.
But please, you can either put a question into the chat or you can ask a question at the bottom of the video below us. But in the absence of that, look, I mentioned earlier to you that one of my biggest challenges with writing a blog is the actual structure of it, right? We've touched on why you should do it, thinking about, what's your mission statement, what's the story you're going to tell a little bit. But let's talk about the structure slightly, the beginning, middle, end. Is it a hero's journey? Am I trying to make it interesting, exciting? Because I feel like I have a pretty boring voice when I write. And is that a problem? Is that okay if it's just informative? So talk to us a little bit about that.
Right. This is what's funny is this is the this kind of gets into the curse of knowledge. You have so much knowledge in your head, and you are not going to be as good a writer as you are like an engineer. There's just like, I'm probably still not as good a writer as I am an engineer, to be honest. And I now write full time. So to be honest, like, be ready to be bad at something. And I think that's actually a big mental leap for a lot of engineers. When you're used to being good at writing software, and then someone tells you write a blog post, and you're kind of bad at it. You can't get your information in a concise way to the right tone. You just kind of like say, nope, not worth doing. Get out of here. But you've got to power through being bad at anything to get good at it. So I'll just first, like, it's okay if you're bad. Be okay, or get better over time. You will. The second thing is to when you're thinking about structure and getting started, copy someone else's structure. So DigitalOcean has a really good style guide out there. You can search DigitalOcean tutorial style guide. If you're writing tutorials, it's super helpful. I have written for them for a couple times for the last few years, and they're so rigid, but it really helps you get things started. So you don't have to, there aren't nearly as many open questions when you have a rigid structure to follow. I would also recommend looking, if you aren't writing a tutorial, let's say you're writing more of a thought leadership piece, which is pretty hard to write. So maybe you don't want to jump straight into that. But if you are, you could look at some other pieces and try to suss out the structure that they've used. A common one, like you mentioned, the hero's journey is a good one. Like that's good for, like, let's say you're kind of walking people through a case study, more or less, where you're like, I started off not knowing how to do X. I had this problem, and then I tried this and it didn't work. And then I talked to my friend and he told me this, and then I, solved it. And then I'm the hero, right? That's kind of the hero's journey. It's like this whole thing. Another way to look at it is like the problem solution path, where you just say, here's an overview of the problem. Here's why that problem is important, how that problem affects our company. And then there's the like solution side, which is, here's the solution I found. Here's why the solution works. Here's what the solution is tactically, step by step. And then here's what happened after we implemented the solution. That's a pretty common pattern as well. It's like problem solution. And you just try to hit the what, why, when, how, whatever, all those, the big questions for it. So if you can't find any if you can't find an existing article that you can copy the structure of, just start thinking about it logically in an outline. I think one thing too that throws a lot of engineers off, if they just look at a blank page and try to start writing, it's super hard. So what I always do, even though I've been writing for years, I never start a piece without an outline, and that outline starts pretty broad and then gets gradually more and more detail as I kind of investigate things and realize the little finer points. And by the end, my outline is kind of like paragraphs that end up getting turned into the article as I copy and paste and move things around. So that's become my style, because I'm so like, structure is so important to writing. But maybe you'll find some middle ground around that.
I really like that last tip on the outline. I've always found that, a friend of mine who also writes, his thing is just start writing something. Get your thoughts on paper, and then you can start to structure it, because again, the most terrifying thing is that blank piece of paper, right? But once you've got stuff, you can start to move it around, shape it up. Brendan asked a fantastic question. So, how do you balance the risk of writing about particularly tricky or contentious topics versus the potential upside? And I guess there's multiple ways to look at this. From leadership, do you want to have challenging, contentious topics about your business? Or from the engineer who has a challenging or contentious topic they really want to write about, or worried about how leadership might see that? What's your advice there? Karl, are you still with us?
I'm here. I lost you for a half second there.
Yeah, we've got you back.
I heard you. Yeah. So if I cut out again, I don't know what's going on. Seems like my internet's good, but you never know.
No worries. You're all good.
Yeah. So there's a couple things you can do to figure out if this is worth it. One is, if you have an audience online, or your company has an audience, or your engineering organization has an audience, maybe it's you can even try like your personal Twitter account. This is what I do personally, is when I have a topic that I want to write about, but I'm not sure if it's going to be well received, I'll tweet about it several times over the course of months. And it's just a way of like, I'll try to distill the core bit of what I'm thinking into a tweet. A, that forces me to focus. And B, it's forcing me to like put something out there that it might be a little contentious. And I just wait and see if people react, or they react to the way I want them to, good, bad, or what have you. And if it makes sense to keep pursuing that idea. And so if you get good feedback from that, I'll give you an example of this. I have this like, this is going to be ironic given where we're currently at, but I have this idea that like listening to experts is kind of dangerous, because experts are so much further on the experience curve than you, that rarely does their advice actually translate to where you are, way down here in beginner land. And so I've been trying to warn people about, like, just when you listen to experts, take it with a grain of salt, because they're in a different spot than you are in life. When you're an entrepreneur, listening to someone who sold 10 companies, it may be not the right thing to do when you're in your first one, like it's just, they have a different perspective. So anyway, I tweet about this, and then I'd say it to people. And so I got a reaction from you about this. So like, clearly that resonated a little bit with you.
Absolutely.
And I actually use that as a way to gauge whether it's worth writing a longer piece about it. And so that's something you can do. If you have an email list, you can do the same thing. That's been really helpful to me when I have like an idea I'm not so sure about. I could test the waters in some way.
That's a brilliant piece of feedback. I might have to steal that one or borrow it. Yeah,
all this
later on, given we're talking about,
but like, put it all with the caveat of I don't want to say I'm an expert, but I'm like pretty experienced. So, it may not work.
Might not work for me, but I might give it a go. I'm a believer in experimenting.
Yes.
So you did touch on something earlier, right? Which is, okay, we've got to the point where we know what we want to talk about. We've written about it. We've engaged our engineering team. They're doing stuff as well. But we've got to get the message out there, right? Any tips for people here on publicizing that content? And I know you mentioned dropping it to specific blogs and sorry, not blogs, but publications that talk about this particular subject. But I know one that is really contentious is, where should I put my blog, right? You did touch on it earlier, and I would really love for you to elaborate on this. Should it go on your own private blog? Should it go on LinkedIn? Should it go on Medium? Where should you put this, and if so, why? And how do you plan that?
Yeah, it's tough. So if your company is very small and you don't think you'll have enough content for it to be worth starting, a new blog, maybe you as the head of engineering or CTO or whatever, you may put it on your personal blog or LinkedIn, or make a quick Medium publication just to kind of get things started. That's kind of an easier way to start. In the long run, though, and if you have a larger organization with more resources, you can spend a little bit more time on this and effort. It's going to be much more beneficial to have it on your own domain name that you control, that is like going to give you, because there's this whole world of search engine optimization, and you don't need to know the details of it, but just know that obviously Google has a way that it picks what goes on the front page of it. And you ultimately want to have some of your articles be on the front page when people search for, say, like your company name plus engineering, or your company name plus engineering hiring process, and things like that. And so you want to rank for these long tail things, and that will happen it'll happen better for you if you have your own personal site, and it'll also give you full control over, say, you could want to add an email capture form at some point so that engineers that want to get regular updates or hear about new jobs can opt into those. Once you do start having some traffic, it's going to be nice to have those sorts of things. So the long-term benefits of it, the long-term solution should be getting stuff onto your own domain name. The short-term, though, can certainly be, let's just get started with a Medium publication, let's say, and let's do it for a year. And if we stick with it for a year, then let's transfer it all over to our own domain name or something like that. So it is contentious, but I wouldn't stress about it in the first year of doing this, because this is, again, it's a long-term effort, and you just want to get started, get that habit going of actually contributing things, figure out the process that you need, figure out the people who are going to contribute. That's a lot more important than the kind of nuts and bolts of where do we host this thing.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. We've got about 2 minutes left. With that, do you have any final tips for all the CTOs, all the CIOs, all the engineers out there who are looking to start writing?
I don't know. I feel like we've covered a lot of the big things and covering the outlines that we did. Another thing that I had in my notes that I hadn't mentioned here is there are some apps that can kind of help you get started or kind of become a better writer over time. So Grammarly is huge, and I am a big fan of Grammarly, especially if you have not written a lot in the past, or you're not a native English speaker. And this is throw another big thing in here is I work with a ton of engineers, and a lot of them are not native English speakers, and it's perfect. You can be an okay writer even if you're not native English. And there's some Grammarly can be really helpful for cleaning up some of these the weird little things that you write that sound natural to you, but native English speakers would say, "No, that's not quite right," And even the British and American English is not the same. So there is no absolute in English anyway. So, but Grammarly is really helpful to me. There's another one called Hemingway Editor you can search for that will show you when you're getting too verbose with your writing. This is one of the common technical problems that a lot of writers have, is that they kind of they drone on like I'm doing right now with this sentence, and they do it in writing though, and in language that is pretty natural, but in writing it comes off as very okay, I got to get past this paragraph, this is forever. Think in short paragraphs, relatively simple sentences, and then the last thing that I do before every blog post I publish is I read it out loud to myself and think, does this sound like me, or sound reasonable for me to have said? And if it doesn't, I go back and kind of rework it. Now, there's a bit of there's some variation here, because some company blogs are very buttoned up. And if you want it to be very buttoned up, it may be a little more formal than you would speak in normal day to day. But if it doesn't sound roughly like what the language in your company's, meetings sound like, then you're probably a little bit off base, either too stuffy or you're too casual, which you can certainly fall into that trap too. So that's the last thing. Other than that, I think we've covered a ton of stuff. I'm happy to connect on Twitter and LinkedIn, as well as my email address. I'll drop it in here too. So if you just happen to want to ask more questions and didn't get to here, I'll put that here. But yeah, it's great talking with you.
Fantastic. Well, Karl, I've dropped Karl's LinkedIn and Twitter into the chat as well as a link to the DigitalOcean technical writing guidelines. Thank you so much, Karl, for your time today. It's been fantastic. I know I've learned a huge amount and will be doing my best to employ some of the tips that you've provided today. Thank you to everybody else who's joined us today for this evening's CTO Craft Bytes on engineering employee branding. And thank you to CTO Craft Bytes for having us. So with that, thank you so much to everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.